If I can just firstly introduce the panelists, of which there are 6 in total. Richard Moorhead is Head of Law and Professor of Law and Professional Ethics at the University of Exeter. He's a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and a former member of the Civil Justice Council. His research covers professional ethics, competence and access to justice. And Richard will be going first for this panel. The second panelist, Omar Madhloom, who is a senior lecturer and solicitor at the University of Bristol Law School. He established 2 university law clinics before joining Bristol in 2017. His areas of research are legal ethics and clinical legal education. Again from Bristol, delighted to be joined by our third panelist, Andrew Charlesworth, who is Professor of Law, Innovation and Society, as I say, at the University of Bristol, where he chairs the Law School's Research Ethics Committee and the university's Research Data Access Committee. He's also a member of the university's Ethics of Research Committee. And we're very lucky also, or rather next, to be joined by Valerie Robertson, who many of you will be familiar with, I'm sure. Valerie is the Pro Bono and Public Legal Education Policy Advisor at the Law Society of England and Wales. She has been involved in pro bono policy for over 18 years and has been an active member of a number of pro bono committees, including the Attorney General's Pro Bono Committee and the Planning Committee for Pro Bono Week, as well as an organizer of 2 previous national pro bono conferences. Valerie has developed and launched the Law Society's Pro Bono Charter and facilitated the Law Society's Grenfell Lawyers Forum. The next panelist is Tim Cave. Tim is a solicitor and the clinic coordinator for the East Greenwich Legal Advice Clinic, that's EGLAC. EGLAC celebrates its 3rd birthday this week, so happy birthday, EGLAC, having been launched as part of the LawWorks Clinics Network in Pro Bono Week 2017. Tim has much older connections with the University of Bristol, having done his law degree there, graduating, sorry for mentioning this, Tim, 1982, there we go. In between Bristol and EGLAC, he spent 31 years at Freshfields in the City of London, where he trained, qualified into the litigation department and was a partner from 1994 until his retirement in 2015. And finally, Professor Jane Jarman, formerly a solicitor specializing in professional indemnity claims against lawyers and other professionals for about 14 years before joining Nottingham Law School. Since becoming an academic, she's designed qualification frameworks for legal professionals, such as registered trademark attorneys, as well as programs in risk and compliance for the Law Society of Hong Kong. She also works in the NLS Legal Advice Centre in the Business and Enterprise team. I should say that we are also joined by Professor Jane Jarman's colleague, Professor Jane Ching, who is not formally one of the panelists, but I understand will be making a contribution later on. So that is the introduction to the panelists, and given the timing is fairly tight, I wonder whether we could get straight into things. And if I could pass over to Richard Moorhead.
Thank you very much indeed. It's lovely to be here to take a break from the law school for an hour or so. So thank you for the invitation. I am a product of clinical legal education. The things that inspired me to become an academic took place in a clinical legal practice course that I did as a student back in the 1980s at Warwick University. So I very much believe in its importance and its value. I wanted just to say a couple of things about pro bono, or the ethics of pro bono, from my slightly unusual perspective as an academic interested in professional ethics and quite interested in the social psychology of ethics as well. I wanted to focus a little bit on motivation, and I wanted to talk a little bit about quality. As some of you all know, I've done quite a bit of work on quality. I do think motivation is really important, and it's almost impossible to escape its importance in relation to anything we do, but perhaps particularly pro bono. I wanted to start with the sort of obvious point that pro bono has to be voluntary. It can't be forced on people directly or indirectly if it's going to be genuinely pro bono. And of course, that's actually quite a hard thing to do. Our motives for doing things for free are complicated. Why have I come here today for nothing? My motives here might be quite complicated. I haven't really thought about what my motives are today. But in terms of pro bono itself, there are quite often elements of marketing to it. Firms use it to try to recruit trainees, and that can complicate our motivations. I think the thing that I'm really interested about, I don't think gets talked about very much, and maybe a little bit of the dark side of even quite good pro bono, is to question whether we can ever really be giving anything for nothing. And I wanted to point to the idea here of moral licensing, and the research on moral licensing is quite interesting and consistent, and it suggests if we do something virtuous, if we do something good, like a big donation to charity or a particularly a kind act, we then tend to actually be prone to unethical acts straight afterwards. We tend to cut ourselves some slack. We balance out our moral calculations. We've been really good over here. We've got this fantastic pro bono thing that we've done over here as a lawyer. And then we go into the courtroom or talk to our clients in the boardroom or wherever it might be. And actually, we've created a sense of our virtue, which we can then sort of trade in for something less virtuous in another slightly different context. And just to ask whether that's sometimes what is going on with the pro bono within the profession. The second thing I wanted to talk about because I know we really want to leave time for questions and probably the more interesting points of the other panelists, is the issue of quality. And this is the thing that's really exercised me over the years, not usually in the pro bono context. I spent a lot of time looking at quality in relation to legal aid and no win, no fee and that sort of thing. Many of you will be aware of the Bevan Ashford case, which I think basically requires the same professional competence in work that's done for free as is done for cost. And that's quite a difficult idea to get your head around. It sort of intuitively feels a bit wrong, and yet that must be right. If you're going to try to help somebody, you have to do it to proper standards. In the fields that I have worked, you'll know that I have tended to find in the research that we did that specialists perform to higher standards, significantly higher standards than generalists. And there is sometimes a risk in pro bono work that we are generalists. We go and do something out of a sense of virtue rather than the sense of our own competence, not always. But it's more complicated even than that. It's not just that we might be dabblers when we do pro bono sometimes, but also that the situation, the nature of the scheme, the structure of it can be quite important. And I just wanted to talk for a minute here about a research project I did with Mark Sefton a few years ago, looking at a particular pro bono scheme that actually employed specialist lawyers. It was a family law pro bono scheme. It employed experienced specialist family law solicitors and barristers, mainly solicitors, I think, but also barristers. And they were asked to advise clients in 40-minute sessions. They would come in at whatever stage their case was in. It might be about to go to court. They might be just thinking about leaving their partner. And they were asked to try to help them with their case. And we would sit and observe these sessions and then try and work out ways of assessing the quality with family lawyers afterwards. And it was really fascinating watching these specialist lawyers try to grapple with for them, a really unusual structure. They were effectively trying to do unbundled family law assistance in 40-minute segments. They had 40 minutes with the client. They might see them for 2 further 40-minute sessions later. And the basic lesson was they could not do it. They could not translate their specialist experience into those clients in that structure in a way that was generally helpful for the clients. They couldn't really do their job, even though they were specialists and they were doing it for nothing. It's probably the clients probably took some value from it, but not a great deal. And sometimes the advice on it was suggested to us when we assessed it with practitioners afterward was unhelpful, or sometimes a little bit worse than that. So the structures around which these schemes are set up can be really important. The other thing that I sort of have an intuition about, rather than any research evidence on, is the converse, that where pro bono cases are taken from beginning to end to completion, that then actually the lawyers, they do get on top of the cases sufficiently to deliver a good, perhaps very good service. Maybe the advice agency, it wasn't an advice agency, the pro bono scheme that I talked about was an aberration. Maybe it's not always like that, but I do remember when I was a trainee and we did pro bono because we were asked to by our partners. We were sort of thrown in the deep end and just got on with advising clients of all sorts of social welfare problems, which we weren't really trained to deal with. And we did what we could, we did our best. But I guess the question there was, why were we doing it? Were we really doing it out of a sense of our own virtue, or because we were being told to, or because we were really helping provide an important service, an important benefit to those people who really needed help? And I'm not quite sure to this day what it was that we were really doing there. So that's where I'll leave it.
Thanks, Richard. Fascinating. And thanks particularly for the idea that in my mind now of the trade-off between virtue and something a bit more nebulous. It sounds to me as though you think motivations for pro bono, for doing pro bono, matter. Is that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, they'll always be mixed and complicated. I guess we have to always ask the question when we do things, are we going to really benefit people if we do what we're doing, or are we doing it for ourselves? So when I came today, was I coming here because I thought people might take something of value from what I'm saying, or because I wanted to feel like I'd made a contribution? Do you see what I mean? And that must be true of the pro bono work. Are we really helping the client, or do you want to give the feeling, the impression to make ourselves feel better by doing that work? That's the kind of the key thing, I think, to keep in people's minds when they're taking on this kind of thing. Are we doing it for proper motives and trying to do it well?
Moving on to another aspect of your presentation, I think quality is something you referred to, the quality of the practitioner, possibly even experienced practitioner, who, when in the context of pro bono, struggles to produce the quality that you're looking for. I mean, is there research in relation to that? And if so, what does it tell us?
Well, I don't know. I was thinking about, I don't know that there is a great deal. There's work on unbundling schemes, which suggests it very much depends on the context. So if pro bono is an unbundled model, it can work if the system is kind of receptive to modest help, if I can put it in those terms. And I mentioned when I was talking about the sort of sense that cases that are really carried through to the bitter end, to trial, essentially, my sense is that sometimes those cases are handled really well. It probably depends on the design of the scheme and supervision and motivation and the underlying competencies of the people, getting those things right for it to be effective. So the scheme that I looked at, it was basically that people had the right levels of competence in theory, but the structures didn't enable them to deliver. They didn't have the time or the tools or the tasks, the ability to really be able to help those clients, because they had 40 minutes to get the story from the client and then to try and think of something to say to the client which was going to help them. And they didn't have that facility to deliver help in a way which the clients could then take away and use. 40 minutes wasn't long enough, and they weren't used to unbundling what they would do on a case to help those clients. They needed much more infrastructure around them for it to work. So those are the only things that I'm aware of, other than research sort of suggesting it might influence people's orientations towards the public interest after they've done it, which is more about educational programs than pro bono in the purest sense.
Okay. I'm very conscious of timing. Richard, thank you ever so much for that. And hopefully the breakout rooms can delve into a little bit more detail in relation to these issues. I need to move over now to Omar. Omar, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Richard. I'm just going to draw on, pick something that Richard Moorhead just said about the mindset of doing pro bono, because the mindset is, which leads into what I'm going to be presenting on in a second, is we're looking at law in terms of behavior. And of course, law is about politics. And when doing pro bono, we also need to, whether lawyers or volunteers or students, it's about reflecting on the behavior and what is going to underpin a lawyer's behavior when they're doing pro bono. So at the University of Bristol's Law Clinic, the supervision, the way we supervise students, we draw on the work of the American jurist and political theorist. He was also an international lawyer, Myers McDougall, who was writing in the 40s and 50s. And although McDougall's work was predominantly in international law, he was also involved in legal education and reform of legal education. And one of the things he advocated was that law students should be trained to be policymakers. And that's very much the approach that we take. It's not just being a transactional lawyer, because most students don't want to be solicitors or barristers. But if you're talking about in terms of educating for policy reform, it also touches on the work that Elaine Hall mentioned in their law clinic, which is about influencing change and policy reform as well. So how do you go about doing that? And what's the skill and knowledge that would influence somebody to be a policymaker, whether they are a partner in a law firm, or they're in-house in a company, or they're working in an NGO, or just with their clients and billing in 6-minute units? So we need some form of a framework that just goes beyond the transactional model. And in the context of pro bono, it has to be also in the public interest. So my starting point is that pro bono and clinical legal education both transcend national jurisdictions. They're global concepts. And this means that in terms of promoting ethical behavior, there has to be a set of universal values that somebody in Nigeria, if they're seconded to a firm in London, they're in terms of pro bono work, they're applying those universal values to address the environment, the changing world, and also anticipate future problems. So how to go about doing that? What I'm suggesting is that we look at the pro bono protocol, which was obviously developed to build on the professional codes of conduct, and it contains a set of standards and requirements. And my suggestion is that we can build on the pro bono protocol by embedding into it the values contained in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the reason for doing that is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's a non-binding document, similar to the pro bono protocol. It's drafted in non-legalistic language, which means anyone from a volunteer to a law student to an experienced practitioner, they can draw on. And it's those values of justice, fairness, equality, and dignity that can then inform the practitioner or the person providing the legal advice or engaged in policy reform. It informs their practice. And basically it's a document that then it's a launch pad for other ethical theories. So whether somebody wants to become, utilitarian or looking at a duty-based approach or consequentialist-based approach, that can then underpin and allows them to reflect. And finally, just to finish off as well, is pro bono, that these values, they're not just about providing the service as well, it's also about within the institutional reform. So it also enhances business ethics and how partners relate to their employees as well. And this issue of acting on the public interest, the reason I'm saying we need to embed this, because the current SRA standards and regulations aren't sufficient. And this was actually pointed out by the SRA themselves in a 2018 report entitled Balancing Duties and Litigation, when they said solicitors should try and move away from being merely hired guns and also acting in the public interest. But unfortunately, the SRA didn't give guidance on how to act in the public interest. So my solution to that is really embed those universal values in a document that we already have, which is the Pro Bono protocol. And I'll stop there.
Thanks ever so much, Omar, and everyone. I've posted a link to reference to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights provided by Omar, so that's hopefully useful. Omar, you mentioned SRA standards and regulations. I mean, do you see them as relevant to the unregulated aspects of pro bono volunteers, such as students?
They form part of it, but they're not. They're not designed for reflective practice. Although the SRA, they have a document about reflection, but that reflection is very much subjective. There has to be some universal objective values that an individual can draw on in relation to being a reflective practitioner, because one of the advantages of reflecting is that we identify things that we did wrong, but also we're anticipating problems as well. And the model of education is very much, unless somebody is going to do, legal theory or one of the optional modules, it's very much centered on black letter law. And black letter law isn't sufficient in terms of reflective practice. I mean, there's plenty of literature on that, so I won't go into detail. To answer your question, the SRA standards and regulations on their own are not enough. And that's actually acknowledged by the SRA themselves. In order to have look at the public interest and act in the public interest, we need some guidance. And for me, what I'm suggesting is that guidance can really come from pro bono, which is in the public interest, because it is underpinned. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the values of doing pro bono are actually aligned. And that's why we can draw on and incorporate them into the protocol. So it's really to inform the standards and regulations.
Understood. Yeah. I'm going to have to move on at this point, timing being very tight. Thank you very much for your pithy answer to my question. Perhaps I can move now to Andrew Charlesworth, Professor of Law again at the University of Bristol. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much. I mean, my engagement with this project came through Omar, came about through discussions with Omar about the extent to which the law clinics were or could be considered as research with human subjects. I mean, I've been chair of the Law School's Research Ethics Committee now for longer than I care to think about. And it's been quite interesting that law came quite late among the social sciences to research ethics, to actually applying research ethics to research with human subjects. And there's been a sort of a period of negotiation with regard to how research ethics will be applied to legal research. And there are therefore still areas of practice within law schools where research hasn't perhaps fallen within the Research Ethics Committee's scope or viewpoint. So for instance, academic teacher training, where academics are doing research with students in the law school, hasn't necessarily been caught by the research ethics process. And equally, I think we see the same kind of thing with law clinics, the extent to which, we need to question the extent to which students are, I suppose, carrying out research with human subjects, carrying out academic work with human subjects, perhaps on which they're going to be assessed at the end of a year, depending on the way the law clinic is set up. And then this raises questions as to what extent should that kind of research academic work be subject to formal ethical oversight? And if it should be subject to formal ethical oversight, by whom should it be subjected to oversight? Is this a job for institutional research ethics committees, or is this something that should be done by some other body? Is this something that is different enough that it doesn't fit the model for traditional research ethics? And that begs the question then, I suppose, what should ethical oversight of student clinic work look like? Do existing ethical processes, but do they scale up to the numbers of people that might be involved? And the law school research ethics committee at the moment doesn't handle huge numbers of cases, let's say. Could we cope with the law clinic turning around and saying, okay, we've got all these students who are engaged with work with human subjects, we're going to need you to perform some kind of oversight? Could we actually do that? Do existing areas of ethical concentration map to the things that are important in clinical practice? And what aspects of clinical practice, what access of law clinic work might require entirely different treatment? So what should ethical training for law clinics look like? I mean, I think one of the concerns is always that clients should be seen as an end in themselves rather than just a means to professional advancement, just as we would say with research subjects in any other form of academic research. The people we're researching on have to be treated as ends in themselves and not a means to an end. To what extent should students be required to undergo some kind of ethical training? What kind of ethical training do they get? Is there a standard? Is there a harmonized standard? How does that relate to the wider ethical review that we would find in other areas of research with human subjects in universities? How do we make it, how do we build it, that kind of ethical review, ethical understanding into a program without making it, and this is a problem we find with research ethics throughout institutional work, without it becoming something where people simply see it as form filling or red tape. Oh, we've got to do this. But you know, if I just copy what somebody else did last year, that'll do. I won't actually have to think, I won't actually have to engage my own thoughts, my own sort of thinking about what it is that I'm doing. So we need to be able to avoid that. It doesn't just want to be cut and paste, as it were, from previous practice. We need people to be thinking about what they're doing, and how do we encourage that? And how do we incorporate this into wider review process at school level, at faculty level, at university level? What can those other areas of ethical review bring to the process? I don't think we should see what the law clinic does as divorced from the other forms of academic work with human subjects. It's of a part. Interestingly enough, I mean, in social sciences, we've always complained bitterly about how we've had the biomedical ethical review process imposed on us in social sciences, and that it doesn't fit. Interestingly enough, for law clinics, perhaps the biomedical research ethics process might actually be in some ways more suitable. And I'll leave that there.
Andrew, thanks very much. That was fascinating, posing a number of important and interesting questions. If I can pin you down possibly on your own view about some of those, what is your personal view about institutional ethical review? And do you think that it should be the same as will be applied in other social science research?
I think there are principles that we can draw from the general research ethics that we would find in social science, but there are going to be practical differences between the application of those principles in terms of law clinics, and the mechanisms through which we identify issues and the methods through which we address those issues may very well be different as well. For example, if I have a research project, somebody has a research project in the law school that has ethical issues, they make an application to us for us to review before they go and do the research ethics, the research project. I'm not sure that the workflow here would fit as well. I mean, we would need to think about how that workflow engages with the work of a clinic. So we're looking to achieve compliance with the same principles, but we may be looking at very different ways of demonstrating that compliance.
Thank you very much. As before, I'm going to have to move us on due to the time constraints. So Valerie Robertson is going to talk to us about a specific area of pro bono, but I'll leave Valerie to tell us what that area is. So over to you, Valerie.
Thanks, Richard. Hello, everyone. I thought it might be interesting just to maybe focus on pro bono work and the ethical issues that arise when a major incident occurs. And when I'm talking about a major incident, I'm speaking about things like terrorist attacks or civil disasters like Grenfell. Unfortunately, the UK has seen quite a number of terrorist attacks over the years and even civic disasters. And for the Law Society, our eyes were maybe really awoken a lot more, specifically in 2017, when we had 4 terrorist incidents take place within a 4-month period of time. And some of the things that started to come up was, first of all, we had an incredible amount of generosity from the entire legal community wanting to help people who had been affected by the terrorist attacks at that time. But the number and the sheer volume of people wanting to help actually started to cause issues. Clinics were getting overwhelmed. Even the Manchester Local Law Society, for example, they were trailblazers at the time, trying to organize all the different volunteers to help with the legal need. But there are issues with that too, because you're getting people now volunteering who, as maybe a clinic coordinator, you have no prior relationship with these volunteers. You don't know what their background is. You don't know if they've done pro bono work previously, and do they understand about the standards of pro bono work and the commitment that comes with pro bono work. I think also too, what tends to happen is when these things happen, there's usually more than one local law clinic or CAB or a local law society in the area. And quite often we tend to work in silos, but actually when it's a major incident and you've got so many people who are involved, whether that's the volunteers or the victims or people who were just caught up in it, you really need to have some sort of coordination to work with each other, to share best practice, to talk about, okay, how are you handling this part? Can you give me some tips on how to deal with some of the influx of volunteers? Or we know we have volunteers who have this type of background. If you're getting specific cases that need these skills and experience, how can we help share all of that? But I think also what we kind of really were surprised about, and it was something quite new at the time, is the role of social media as well as the media in these kind of incidents. So we found that there was a lot of people who were volunteering on Twitter, and there could be ethical questions with that. You know, throwing yourself out there on Twitter saying, I will give free help to anyone who's affected by this incident. Is that a genuine volunteer? You know, are you going to actually stick with it? Are you going to try and contact a clinic to offer your services? Are you just promoting yourself on social media? With Grenfell, there was a lot of issues about potential ambulance chasing. And I think the reality was a lot of firms or different individuals were really trying to help and wanting to put their services out there, but there's unintended consequences sometimes with how you go about to offer those services, and it can be misinterpreted quite easily. I think also people don't necessarily recognize that in certain incidents, so for example, Grenfell, because that involved the state, there was an incredible amount of distrust from those who were either victims or a part of the bereaved family or just people who lived in that local community. So they were really, really cautious about who they wanted to take on for legal representation. And the vast majority of them had never come into contact with the legal community before. So that mistrust was leading to a lot of issues as well. Some of them felt pressured to sign up to a law firm. Other times what was happening is they may sign up to a law firm or go to a clinic and be getting help that way. But then one of their neighbors was using someone else, and they were talking with that neighbor and felt that that neighbor was maybe getting better quality service. So they wanted to switch to the other law firm. There was a lot of issues around that and trying to really kind of grapple with it to give the best service to these people who were incredibly traumatized by these incidents. So
Valerie, sorry, could I just jump in? I'm very sorry, the timing is so very tight. And I really wanted to get a question to you about whether any key lessons have been learned out of incidents such as this, and if so, what they are.
Yeah, so first and foremost, I think it really is the coordination of the local community. All the different local advice agencies and clinics, if there's a local law society, really try and talk together. What the Law Society has done or is trying to do, we've developed a major incidents response plan. And the idea of that is it'll be a quick, simple form for anyone who's been affected by a major incident that they can fill in. We will already have a panel of those who want to volunteer their services pro bono. They'll already have been vetted, and then they can match themselves up with the inquiries coming in. So for me, it's really about the coordination aspect.
Thank you ever so much, Valerie. I think we're going to have to move on to our next panelist. So Tim Cave, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. And as you mentioned earlier, in between my law degree at Bristol and volunteering at EGLAC, the East Greenwich Legal Advice Clinic, I spent 31 years in a City of London law firm as a solicitor there. It won't come as a surprise if I say that practicing law in a large international law firm and in a small Southeast London pro bono clinic are quite different experiences. However, in one vital respect, they're very similar. And that similarity centers on the importance of your client. The lawyer's role in both settings is to do the best that you can for your client. And this is recognized in SRA Principle 7, which speaks of acting in the best interest of each client. And is echoed in the joint pro bono protocol that's been mentioned earlier today. Paragraph 8 of that speaks of a lawyer who undertakes pro bono work, giving that work the same priority, attention and care as would apply to paid work. I should add that it is of course the case that the solicitor's duty to act in his client's best interest sits alongside, and where there's a conflict, it's subservient to SRA Principle 1. And that principle requires solicitors to act in a way which upholds the rule of law and the proper administration of justice. So whilst acknowledging the centrality of the client in both private practice and the pro bono setting, it is of course the case that the types of clients that we act for can vary very significantly. And I want to focus on a particular category of client, a category that was mentioned a lot in panel 1, and that is the preponderance at pro bono clinics to see vulnerable clients. What do the ethics of acting for vulnerable clients look like? How does the pro bono lawyer or the pro bono clinic best act in the best interest of vulnerable clients? First of all, what do I mean by vulnerable clients? In wider society, there are lots of different definitions depending upon the context that you're considering. The key elements focus on people who, by reason of their physical, mental, economic or environmental situation, are unable to protect themselves against significant harm or exploitation. In the legal clinic environment, those who practice in all the main areas of pro bono work, family, welfare benefits, immigration, housing, and many others, will be very aware of clients not only struggling with legal issues, but whose legal problem is compounded by their personal circumstances. circumstances which often make their day-to-day life traumatic or difficult. It's taken as read, and it's been mentioned earlier today, that the service we provide to all clients, whether vulnerable or not, should be undertaken to a high standard. And that standard too is embedded in the joint pro bono protocol that I've referred to. But I believe that the context in which our advice is delivered is important too. The vulnerable client's encounter with a pro bono clinic and their experience of how they are dealt with is, I would suggest, a vitally important aspect of the service we provide. Let me give an example. And this comes from a letter that was written by one of our clients as he reflected on his experience. He wrote, "I have a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, PTSD, alcohol addiction, self-harm. I hear voices and have false beliefs. I can be quite blunt. I'm very sensitive and can be paranoid, anxious." Having written of the difficulties that he had in getting legal assistance, he continued, "I was advised to phone EGLAC. I left a message and the call was returned, inviting me to attend a meeting. I was absolutely petrified, confused. I took extra medication and attended. I was met by a man at the door and offered a cup of tea. I declined. The meeting place had 2 other people waiting. It was not threatening. I decided to stay." If we are serious about increasing access to justice for the most vulnerable in society, we have to be serious about the environment in which we provide that advice and the way in which it is delivered. I have little doubt that the petrified client, who was just able to overcome his fears and anxieties to stay for a clinic appointment, would never have made it through the impressively daunting revolving doors and the plush reception of the law firm that I worked at for over 30 years. There's more that I could say about the way that best advice is provided to vulnerable clients. Issues of clarity, simplicity, and jargon-free advice being 3 key aspects. We may have an opportunity to consider some of these issues and aspects of the client service in the breakout room later. But perhaps the most important skill is the human one, treating the vulnerable client with dignity, respect, and at heart simply another member of the human race, just like you or me. Thank you.
Tim, thank you very much for that. So talking about those vulnerable clients that come through EGLAC's door, how do you manage their expectations? How do you explain the role that you're going to play in their lives? And also what assistance and how much is involved?
Well, I think it's important to be clear and frank with clients about what we can and what we cannot do. That's important in managing their expectations. We operate an appointment-only clinic, so we will have a call with all of our prospective clients first, in which we will find out what their issue is about. We want to know whether or not it's something that we can realistically help with. And in that call, we'll explain to them that they've been invited to an appointment session, which is a 45-minute appointment. And at that session, we will explore in more detail their issue and see how we might be able to help. I was very interested by the comments Richard was making earlier about the research he'd done around 40-minute appointments being not terribly satisfactory. Well, I think the fact we do a triage first, so our volunteers know the nature of the problem before the client turns up, is helpful. And I think that the 45 minutes in many cases can provide very valuable advice, and certainly that's a lot of the feedback that we've got. We have 3 of our volunteers. We've got 10 solicitors. They're all qualified solicitors who are part of our clinic. And 3 of them, myself and 2 others, we're retired. We're not doing this at the end of a hard day in the office, so it's somewhat easy for us, and we can take on case representation. And again, at every aspect of that, we will be clear as to what we can do, and an important part of it is not to overpromise or to try and make out that we're going to make everything okay for these people, because often that is not the case. And we take on cases sometimes where frankly we are seriously on the back foot with default judgments and the like having been made, and we're just trying to make the best of a very difficult situation. So clarity, frankness, openness, and being realistic about what we can achieve are very important.
Thanks very much for that, Tim. Again, I think timings pushes me forward. Jane, Professor Jane Jarman, perhaps we can turn to you.
Well, thank you. I'm very much struck by the links between Tim's presentation just now and what I'm going to say. I was asked, I think probably because of my background in professional indemnity insurance for the legal profession, to talk a little bit about mistakes and how to deal with mistakes when they occur, because of a career in private practice dealing with mistakes when they happen. It's always the nightmare of a lawyer. And I think we've talked a little bit about secondary trauma this morning, and it's become very apparent to me that a lot of the work I did with the legal profession during my practicing career was probably a little bit of counselling about the context in which they had made a mistake. And I want to focus this morning on 4 or 5 very short issues about what is effectively the pathology of those mistakes. And indemnity lawyers are very good at the pathology of mistakes in legal practice. And I want to focus not on what happened, what was the cause of the claim. Anybody can miss registering a charge, for instance. It's what caused the cause. And that's what I'm going to focus on. And I think the clinical setting and the clinical setting for students in law clinics provides an opportunity to set the dials for a career. There's a primacy of the client and the importance of the client, but also those working with students in particular, and we focus on that today, have an obligation, I think, and a duty to help the student to understand the context in which they are working. And that's why I'm looking at what's the cause of the cause. First of all, they need to know that mistakes, they're a thing, they happen. I think it was the Bates and the post office case, you know, infallibility is a rare commodity, but it's how you deal with a mistake that's important. Because often mistake does not equate to negligence. It's possible a lot of times to repair, to correct, and there's no loss caused. So that's the first thing. Mistakes are a thing, get used to it. The second point is, how do you deal with the mistake? And again, that's a thing. And if you're a practicing lawyer, there is somebody in your head right now who did not completely lose it when you made your first mistake. And it is a truism, I think, that, you know, those that do evil, to whom evil is done, do evil in return. The way in which you are dealt with when there is a mistake transmits. And I learned that a lot in professional negligence work, that it became a thing. A claim was made against perhaps an assistant solicitor. How they were treated would transmit like a radioactive load to the rest of their colleagues. And if they were supported and they were able to move on with their career, it wasn't seen as a big deal. And that is a good kind of ethical and cultural sanitizer, really, for the profession. And in that context, I was struck by what Omar said about reflection. If reflective approach had been used a lot more in the legal sector, it would start to reduce the amount of potential claims. I'm absolutely certain of that. The next point I've thought about is unlocking decision-making. Sometimes the decision-making of the practitioner is hidden, and it's certainly hidden from the novice. it's actually quite important. And I've not got the time to go into a case called Connolly and the Law Society in 2007, but the professional indemnity litigators really like the Connolly defence, when it's talking in the context of conflict of interest, but this idea of the honest and genuine decision of a solicitor. Everybody has said this morning about SRA stars. That's not all there is. It's not nearly enough. What's interesting about cases like Connolly and the Law Society is the extent to which what we would understand as an ethical response is at the heart of the decision-making process of the lawyer, and actually unlocking what a lawyer does and making that clear to a novice is an obligation, not just of supervision within the context of clinical legal education within the pro bono sector, but it's also a gift to the practicing legal profession that may not appreciate that it's a hidden mechanism at work. The next 2 points, and then I'll finish. First of all, to do with supervision. Supervision can feel like it's a dead hand. It is not the child of risk management protocols. I've done a lot of work on risk management protocols, but if you think the file will tell you what's going on, you are mistaken. Cases are about human motivation. They're about engagement, are about dialogue. And so how can you support the dialogue between everybody in a team, irrespective of whether they are a partner, whether they are senior, whether they are the most junior person in the room? Any professional indemnity litigator knows that sometimes it is a trainee, it is a very new and very junior person that says, well, this doesn't seem right. That's what a clinic can do. It can show this is the way to work. And when you go into private practice, the fact that you feel it seems not to be right, no, you know it's not right, because somebody has set the dials for you very early in your career about justice, fairness, equality, and respect. And that is a gift of this particular area, because you are dealing with things that are difficult, and there is a little bit of ethical heat. And that brings me to the final point. And resilience is talked about quite a lot in the context of ethics. There's seemingly a link across between the two. But how do you get those ethical calluses? How do you build that? It's only by a certain amount of heat to realize that this engagement is not passive. It is actually extremely active. And working in a culture which enables you to be open, enables you to question, enables you to model from the person that is the most senior person in the room, that sometimes they say, look, I don't know, let's look at it and let's look at it together, is, I believe, very much what we can take forward in this context, in the context of avoiding mistakes. And that is what Stephen Mason said this morning about this continual realization of legal ethics. And that continual realization of legal ethics, particularly in this context, can be setting those dials for ethical response throughout the career.
Thanks, Jane. Perhaps I can ask you a question very quickly. You mentioned mistakes. So I wonder whether there is a regulatory angle here. What you think the role of regulation is, and bearing in mind that we're discussing pro bono, and that's what we're about, is there a case for lighter touch regulation? Are there examples that we can draw from elsewhere, possibly?
Yeah. I think you're right. This idea of mistakes, but it has two consequences. It has a regulatory context in terms of, say, SRA stars. It has an insurance context as well, dependent upon the nature of the insurance and the duties to ensure whether there are circumstances amounting to a claim. So there is a potential chilling effect associated with any kind of involvement in law, and particularly when you look at the insurance situation to say, well, you know, law firms are all very well aware of is anything known every time they renew insurance, but certainly the regulatory arrangements can have a kind of a drag effect on innovation and development. And that isn't really commensurate to the risk. So you are putting a massive load onto a sector where it would be, the risks are not the same. So somebody said this morning, pro bono traditionally don't do property work, don't hold money, for instance, in that context. So there is at least an argument to say there should be some regulatory and bolt-on insurance arrangements that's commensurate with the risk. I think that is an area where the Intellectual Property Regulation Board has started to try and make a move in the past few years to try and involve more people in intellectual property pro bono work, not least by having a little bit more flexibility in its regulatory structures to allow in-house lawyers, or a lot of in-house IP lawyers, to provide pro bono work. But the regulatory oversight of legal advice is something that needs to be considered, not least insurance arrangements, which is originally my area.
Thank you for that. And perhaps if I can just, last thing, squeeze a question in. I mean, you talked about the response to mistakes too. Suggests to me supervisor's role is very important there. I think we have been joined by Professor Jane Ching, also of Nottingham Law School, who I understand might have some contribution to make there. So Professor Ching, if I could ask you, and if you are there in fact, what are the requirements of a good pro bono supervisor?
Well, I hope I'm there. I think it is telling me that I'm visible and so on. My particular concern is generally about what I might call the plight of new lawyers in the workplace. And we hear a lot about toxic work environments and so on. And it struck me that everybody speaking today has been talking about some of the challenges. So it's the challenges of people, whether they're students or whether they're practitioners, moving in pro bono work to things that they don't normally do and may find more traumatic. We've talked about the particularly vulnerable nature of clients. And I start wondering about supervision. My colleague Jane Jarman has just been talking about the way in which good supervision in what might be described as the more learning conscious environment of a student clinic can set people up for certain expectations about how supervision should work in the more task conscious context of a law firm. I don't claim to have a comprehensive knowledge of all regulatory processes across the world, but I do only know one jurisdiction in which a supervisor in the workplace is required to have any kind of educational background or coaching experience. So it seems to me that potentially there is a different role for the student clinic supervisor as against the law firm supervisor, because you're dealing with a different category of people, possibly a different category of activity. The law firm supervisor has got a problem because they've got to get the job done. And of course, in fee pay work, they've particularly got to get the job done. And how they manage the job can hinder the education of the individual. And I think perhaps for pro bono work, and this is something that perhaps this group or Clio or other groups could do, is to think perhaps a bit more about the special nature of pro bono supervision and the educational aspects of it and the counselling aspects of it to people who are dealing with difficult circumstances that they wouldn't normally experience, and produce some sort of guidelines. Because I think one of the things we are very adrift at is knowing precisely what makes good law firm supervision. We can spot really bad law firm supervision, and the SRA will in fact put conditions on people's practicing certificates to stop them doing it if they do it particularly badly. There's a book that's just come out in Australia on law firm supervision. I have to say I haven't read it yet. But there's that whole area about what do we mean, and I think the pro bono community is in a particularly good place to start thinking about what does supervision mean in this particular context. I'm sorry, I rambled, but I'll shut up now.
Well, you certainly didn't ramble, and that was very helpful, Jane. Thank you very much. Apologies to the breakout rooms, which are going to be somewhat shortened. Claire, perhaps I can